It had been a long weekend. The final hours of the blessed relief from adolescence was making Severus Snape feel a little uneasy. He stared at the parchment again and then back to the slightly grubby A4-lined paper that had arrived in his possession 3 days ago. He had it. The 3 words above were not nearly as strong to describe the end result of the process that had taken place over the last year. However, Snape hadn't the will or desire to search for appropriate vocabulary. All that mattered was what happened next. He sat back in the tall-backed black chair that had, legend had it, stood in the office even before the school was built, the back of his hand brushing its smooth surface. No, Snape corrected himself. The process hadn't begun a year ago. The information that Cecilia Frobisher had discovered through her meticulous detective work when she had been at the school revealed that the desire to rediscover a connection, or establish a cause for the difference between moles and wizards had been sought for millennia. He glanced back at the paper, reaching for his left arm again. Which wasn't causing him pain. Snape rolled up his sleeve and in the impoverished light radiating from the tree of tallow candles he inspected his scar. Unlike the scar bestowed upon Harry Potter by Lord Voldemort, his scar had been born his own volition. Snape looked at its lines and contours, the shape of the head and body with its helical tail etched forever into his flesh. His eyes strayed from his mutilated limb and rested on the 2 vials of potion that stood next to the documents. This time it was right. It would have been right, of course, had he continued with the work in February and not decided to protect the boy. He had not banked on Cecilia Frobisher's willfulness. In fact, Severus Snape told himself, there had been a lot of things concerning Mrs. Frobisher that he had not banked on, even he, who considered all things coldly. Snape's mind scrolled to the future and fixed on his now ex-research partner. Taking the Polyjuice potion to become him had been highly risky and foolish, but he was familiar with the motivation. By now the adverse effects, even with his highly risky and foolish cure, were enough to cause her internal damage. Being away from Lupin had its advantages in that further foolish acts could now be avoided. He looked back at the 3rd document. A crumpled paper again which he had rescued long ago from the hearth in the teacher's room 3 doors down from him that the previous occupant had attempted to burn in a fit of anger. She hadn't succeeded and Snape was glad of it. Even without her presence at Hogwarts, Mrs. Frobisher's power was still being felt. It is likely that wizards chose to isolate themselves from moles not as much for their own superiority but for the protection of moles. That had been the sentence that had made Severus Snape interrogate Minerva McGonagall the previous evening. The witch had agreed to assist but clearly had no idea of the extent that she was letting herself in for. However, Snape was not going to let the potion suffer for his lack of care and attention to detail, and Minerva was an accomplished anthropologist, at least when it came to wizards. He supposed that was what made her good with children. He read the sentence again and then recalled his own conclusion. Unalloyed magic would affect them, he had proposed. McGonagall had looked skeptical, but offered advice and had engaged Snape in a discourse in the changes in the ministry during the 1930s. Had it not been for Bertram Falkright, who had been more liberal towards moles than the culture since the 18th century edicts, then wizards would not have protested their fear that they would lose their way of life. Had not Phineas Nigellus's death come about, who had, Minerva had reminded Snape, treated moles appallingly and instructed others to do the same, then it would not have been on the consciences of the pro-mole wizard in Diagon. Put like that, Snape conceded privately, the world of wizards could be conceived of as interesting. They discussed reciprocation and Minerva concluded that Raymond Lully's lack of caution in recruiting others had led to Oswald Avery's involvement, who had once worked in the Department of Mysteries. Snape had been impressed, though he realized now that he shouldn't have been. Minerva McGonagall's character had long been known to him, and beneath her austerity he knew that she was as perceptive and intelligent as she was sharp. Taking this on board, he had taken the discussion further by commenting that those days had been the ones in which anyone declared Mistborn had been considered fair game for any wizard to kill. Minerva had agreed and told him to trust the judgment of his actions. That was all very well for the McGonagall to say, thought Snape as he traced the leaded decoration on the small window and noted the shafts of elderly sunlight that had dared to invade his stone-walled office, but she was alone. She could not help or reassure him that the potion was scientifically correct. He could not help her either. But he still needed information. Information that he knew Cecilia would both unravel and yield. A personalized potion. It had been said that it couldn't be done, but then whoever had said that clearly had no understanding of science. He looked at the parchment again where he had committed the base and match. The universal link, he had written, is bounded by factors including age, physical traits and even emotions. Changes can occur in addition to heritable factors such as time spent in a magical environment or by choice. Out of the drawer he took the bundle of papers, some burned, some crumpled, some liberated from a fire just in time and, of course, the notebooks that he had seized when he had taken Mrs. Frobisher to safety. Staring at the pile, Snape considered everything she had done. Could he have done it without her but not in the time? Something had to be delayed so that he had chance to finish it, and Dumbledore had made sure of that. And then there was the other potion, the one which involved far more of a leap of faith and recalled person who had given him the letters that were helping her help him. It had been for her safety that he had agreed to do it. Now the person who shone brightest in his life had the information to help her have a purpose for the thing, and the thing. He would see to it that it would not harm her again. Now all that he needed to do was dash. Severus. Out of courtesy, Dumbledore knocked on the inner office door of the potions classroom. Severus Snape turned as the headmaster glided across to the desk. You have the potion, I see? It is all completed? Snape neither nodded nor shook his head. Instead he handed the match potion to Dumbledore. I cannot understand exactly what is needed. In terms of magic, I am entirely certain that it will have the desired effects when Potter takes it. Indeed, it is the science that I am mostly concerned about. Dumbledore put down the match and picked up the base. You are saying then that magically, were Harry Potter to take them, he would become bereft of his magical ability? Ah, that is indeed magical, Severus, he concluded, looking contentedly at Snape's face. When his teacher of potions did not reply, Dumbledore replaced the vial in his hand where it had stood minutes before and sat on the twin chair on which Snape was sitting. Clearly you feel the science is important, and that it needs due consideration before our plot to lure Voldemort comes into play? He glanced at the table again where Snape had unrolled what looked to be like a black velvet jewelry roll with padding in between narrow sections. And, in between each of the folds, the word dash. The strands of hair that you see here have come from extraordinary wizards. You are familiar with the notion, the amendments that Mrs. Frobisher saw fit to consider, of the nature of magic? Dumbledore nodded. These strands come from wizards and witches whose magical ability is dubious or at least very unusual. It would be foolish if we did not allow time for these to be considered. He stopped. Dumbledore glanced over the velvet with interest. Then he looked back at Snape. We also need further time if we are to come to a conclusion about the Wolfsbane potion. I am certain that, from Miss Evans's meticulous notes, that she will work loose the problem. I left her with little else. And your motives for this? How far do they extend to your feelings for Mrs. Frobisher? I trust that you do not think that emotion has prompted me to act or give advice in a manner that does not put our cause paramount. Snape got to his feet and walked towards the stone shelves and stopped just in front of them. He turned. I do not deny that I care for Mrs. Frobisher's welfare. To leave her in the care of Fletcher and another mole. He looked at the envelope in which the letter that had arrived for him that lay innocently on the desk, upon which his name had been written in familiar handwriting above that of Dumbledore's. He tore his mind away from a time long ago and looked at the aforementioned addressee. Even in a non-magical environment it is unlikely that she will ever recover fully from her exposure to the high concentration of magic that we have here. Her health might, if she is fortunate, merely remain poor. However, any future relationship with Wizard, especially one with such a debilitation himself. I gave her due warning, and she should be by now fully aware of the implications of reproducing with one such as Lupin. Dumbledore nodded his head and held up a hand. You realize of course that the path that they choose is entirely their own, that you must not interfere with its course. Whatever the Ministry might believe, a betrothal still has power in our world. Snape said nothing, and did not move. You are clear, Severus? Indeed. The word reverberated around the stone-walled office and hung in the air for a second. Then he looked at Dumbledore. What do you hope to gain from the scientific work? What do you hope your results to yield? I expect, although I was not alone in my supposition, that those who are partially magical, Miss Penright for example, Ted Tonks, may have a connection to other wizards, and that those who can change their appearance at will. Metamorphomagi for example. Lupin's sample is yet to be analyzed, and we have a further sample for Mrs. Dursley. Snape got up to his feet and began to inspect the potion vials again, and one for her son. Whatever the genetics for these wizards, the results will directly affect the hypothesis of the link. It is only right that I investigate it for the potion. He looked at Dumbledore and watched him wiggle his mouth, which caused his beard to wobble. And how goes the infiltration of the enemy's defenses? The rumor that any of the Dark Lord's followers have a chance of redemption has been kept in circulation since the Great Battle. When I ascertain who is willing to turn against him, I will administer the potion myself. Their bargain is that they will turn information into the Ministry, that their link to the Dark Lord can be severed. There are many who will take the opportunity. I see. Dumbledore nodded and rose himself. In that case, please continue with your vital work, Severus, with each and every facet. 88,888,888. Darren Malloy was getting annoyed. His third week at Smeltings was about to begin, and he had nothing of value to show for his time there. In the safety of the preparatory room, something akin to the Slytherin common room and just as welcoming, Draco banged his fist on the wall, causing a canvas-backed picture of the founder of the school to bang back and forth in retaliation. He glared at the inanimate mole who would not, as he had discovered, spring to life like wizard portraits, something that had caused him to be inconvenienced in his seeking of relevant, useful, scientific information by Mr. McFarlane, his housemaster, to discuss how he was settling in. In fact, Darren Malloy was settling into Smeltings remarkably well. There had been times, glints of occasions in the last week, where he had almost forgotten that he was a wizard, most significantly for a whole afternoon where he and Dudley had spent the entire afternoon skiving a particularly boring geography lesson and had retired in the sun to plan an intricate attack on the Stoneheads, including Aza, who had recovered from Draco's last encounter with him in the park and was now spoiling for a punch-up. Draco gritted his teeth menacingly as he thought of the hard man of Stonewall, and his thoughts turned to Dudley and the opportunity that had so nearly come his way. He clenched his fists as he recalled Mr. Dursley driving him back to school and mistaking Draco's silent seething for nervousness. He had engaged Draco in a serious discussion about career prospects about which Darren Malloy had talked about it comfortably, and it occurred to Draco that perhaps there were some aspects of the mole world that he had been able to adapt and cope with. Perhaps this place had a power of its own. Staring at the portrait over the fireplace again, he turned his thoughts to his quest. Apart from science lessons, being taught how materials behaved, what forces affected what, and human biology in all its glorious detail, the subject where he focused the most of his energies, little else was of much use, and despite his eagerness to assist his father, he was becoming inclined to agree with his mother that, if it took centuries and one fortuitously placed mile a year to discover this wretched stuff, then it's not going to be much use our son going out there. But he had, And he was here and hope was fading fast. And not just his. The image of this omnipotent power which both terrified and held wizards enraptured was slowly disappearing. He knew that Voldemort's followers were failing him, giving up help, and now, and worse still, the Dark Lord knew it too. In his mind Draco had envisaged holding the key, being gloriously welcomed into the inner sanctum of Death Eaters, his name ringing with triumph rather than whispered in shame. Now, having spent so much time with the moles, he had nothing to show for it. Damnation. He needed it to work. He had painted himself into a corner with very little negotiation power, other than trust that something would turn up. And, though he was loath to admit it, what was scaring Draco Malfoy the most was how well he was fitting in with Dudley and company. Draco continued to pace around the prep room, on centuries-looking decade-old carpet, and, when his legs could stand it no more, he took to the nearest chair and threw himself in it, sighing in annoyed frustration as he reached for his exercise book and reading through the notes he had made from his last week's lessons. Malfoy hated it. There was no real discovery in the lessons taught. So far it had consisted of merely reproducing experiments that mole people did years ago. Nothing was new in their learning, nothing to find out. He had brought the matter to the attention of Mr. Smith, the science teacher, who had been taken aback at the notion that Darren had been obliged to wait for his answer an hour into his own free time for the answer. Draco shook his head and read his handwritten notes. So many things were so different to Hogwarts, yet, some things the same. He doubted whether Hogwarts teachers would be able to manage with what smelting teachers had to do, even though the basic job was the same. Opening his book again, Draco read a few sentences about the basic structure and function of a cell before throwing the exercise book onto the floor. The work was so dumb. And not just science. McFarlane had quickly established that he was considerably behind in many of his subjects and had given him remedial work in order to help him catch up. Kicking the book as he got to his feet, Draco resumed his solitary marching. At least they had showed him some chemical reactions which all to do with energy, Dudley had said proudly. He couldn't begin to call them friends but associates in a common cause. They too seemed on a mission to oppose moles by their very manners and actions. It was this that had caused Draco to ponder a point, something none of the other Death Eaters, his father included, had considered. It was something that had been literally very close to Draco's heart when Dudley had demonstrated to them all the pressure gun that apparently his science tutor had allowed him to not only build but test on the local park. A part of Draco began to swell, part with envy, another with pride, and he rolled the thought around in his mind. His naivety in the previous days' ballistics had given him an idea. What if they were using mole weapons, like guns, bombs, etc.? He had had no thought for his own safety. What if the enemy knew this too and designed an attack on the Dark Lord? What if? Hastily sitting down, and adding a mental note to wangle an invitation to Dudley's house when the moment ago, Draco began to think. 88,888,888. In the darkened living room in his grandmother's cottage, she felt closer to him. They all felt closer to him. Crouched on the carpet, he looked around him, at his belongings, those of his family and of Cecilia. All exhibits now in an error investigation. All to be taken away to the ministry and used as evidence. There was little that Remus could do. He had been barred from using magic, otherwise he would have disapparated the lot to Grimmauld Place. His friend had been so generous to him by allowing him to stay there even when he had lost his temper and had gone for Snape. Sirius said he didn't care about that and that the destruction of his bedroom had made an improvement on the place. He had smiled at his friend, but knew deep down that his presence was becoming wearing on his friend. Even through his imperfect eyes Remus could see Sirius becoming exhausted and withdrawn as the days had gone by. He closed his eyes and then opened them again. What did they want with all of these things? He inched his way across the carpet and to the effects that had been in the cellar, his grandmother's clippings from the Daily Prophet. his father's bookbinding materials. The china tea set that his mother had bought on a whim when he was very young when they were on holiday in Devon. Here, with the material possessions belonging to his family, Remus felt a strange affinity to his family, and he recalled a happier time when his father had recounted tales of his trade, telling him about his friend Raymond Lully and his imported books which he bound and sold on to specialist bookshops. Flourish and Blots had been one of his biggest customers. What did they want with her things? Few remained now. It rankled with Remus that the ministeriers who had arrived on the day that she absconded had taken most of what remained, as if it was necessary to take something. But there was nothing he could do about it. A lone teardrop rolled down his left cheek as he looked at a pile of clothes that belonged to Cecilia, which were clearly part of the evidence too, and he sank to his knees, reaching for a tablecloth and feeling thoroughly miserable. It was one of his mother's, nothing elaborate, just linen embroidered with large yellow daisies in a kind of loopy stitch that he remembered his mother sewing on anything she made for a time, and his eyes wandered to the Daily Prophets. He remembered once, about a month ago, when he had seen Cecilia reading through some of these things. He hadn't minded, one day they would be her family things too. His mind then leaned to thoughts of Tunks, and upon his already wretched feelings guilt began to press hard. Remus had dreamed about Tunks. And a child. That was one of the reasons he had felt it necessary to return to his home. Even when he knew he shouldn't be there. Remus stared out of the window at the forget-me-not-colored sky before dropping his head and staring at his trousers. What he was wearing was all he had. The ministry had seen fit to claim all of his belongings too, his clothes included. The letter informing Remus of this information had arrived via a very confused owl that morning, and it had been retrieved by Molly Weasley. Once he had read it, he had felt compelled to return to his home. He reached up to his neck and felt for the chain and pendant that graced his neck, slender and slim. At least he had something. It belonged to Cecilia Frobisher, and he had not removed it since the evening he had taken it. The night 2 days after Christmas, when Sirius had convinced him that she would not understand. Cecilia had assumed she had lost it when her home was destroyed, but Remus had planned to give it to her as a wedding gift when they eventually got married. He shouldn't be back here, he knew, not since she had been taken. Discovered by the ministry. Despite the ban on spells, he had put some on the place as best he could for security, but they had broken Dumbledore's spells. How long before they found him? And besides, he was unlikely to be that welcome at Grimmauld Place at the moment, after the arguments he had had with both Mrs. Weasley and Sirius. Remus clenched his fists. No one, not even his best friend, seemed to realize what it felt like to lose her. Picking up her navy cardigan, he began to cry. He had lived with the wolves. That had been where he was when Dumbledore found him and saved him. He had heard that werewolves who opt to stay as wolves consciously without the lunar influence would eventually forget they had ever been humans and remain as wolves for the rest of their dog days. If he had not been persuaded by the wizard to become a teacher at his old school, then this wouldn't have happened. Remus looked round his house. Not his house. It was forfeit. Everything belonged to the ministry. Everything. They even wanted to own His. Clutching the cardigan tighter, he wept. After a time, thoughts other than all-consuming self-pity permeated his mind. He remembered Sirius sitting with him when he took him back to the cottage after transforming into a werewolf without his potion. He had neglected to take it, and so his friend had taken him back there and stopped with him until he became human again. This was the last place he wanted to be, but it was safe. That was the wretched point. It was safe, both for him and for others. He had woken up by the fire again, and Sirius had left soon after, and for a long time he'd lain there watching the cumulonimbus clouds hug the high mountains on the horizon, their contents threatening to spill over the crests, dampening their crowns like a wrung dishcloth, and he probably would have remained there still if an owl carrying a blue-ribboned letter hadn't attracted his attention to the window in the kitchen. They now wanted to speak to him about his actions. The official line read, assisting with valuable ministry information. But Remus knew what it was he was required to do. And what it might lead to if his answers were not what the interrogators wanted. It wasn't as if he hadn't known apparition was forbidden under the werewolf code, but he had been doing it so often back and forth between the cottage and the forbidden forest, the cottage and Grimmauld Place, the cottage and Hogwarts, that he hadn't given it a second thought. Remus thought back to the first time he apparated there illicitly. The last time Sirius had come back with him. Just before Sirius had been wrongfully imprisoned. Remus remembered his own mother chiding Sirius most heartily for encouraging him to break the code. But his friend had charmed her round in the end, proclaiming that, in the 1980s, the Ministry gave some latitude and complimenting her on her unique decorative taste. Looking around at the well-dated furniture, Remus laughed at the irony. At the time most of these things were new and had been stylish, if a little old in taste. His eyes rested on the left-hand side of the city next to the half-panelled wall, where he was so accustomed to seeing Cecilia, and he tried to remember the last time she was sitting here, what she was talking about, what they were doing. But whatever it was, or what was said, he couldn't. A shudder of distress passed through his body as Remus's longing for his mate became physical. He ached for her presence. His heart thumped behind his ribs as his frustration. His breath became quicker and more impatient as he thought about her beautiful smile. With an outstretched palm he blasted an old yellowing oil painting from the wall in frustrated aggravation before resuming his coiled position in front of the fire, where he had been that morning and in which he now sought comfort. The rug on which he was lying was still adorned with his wolf hair, and Remus sobbed, not caring how pathetic and wretched he would seem someone were to see him now. His thoughts drifted towards her. Is Cecilia? Why did she agree to go? Why had it been Snape who had taken her? Why did no one fight the Ministry? Why would no one tell her where she was? Remus did not know how long he lay there, tears eventually stemming and evaporating, leaving saliness deposits on his skin as he turned his anger on himself, and he imagined himself telling Cecilia the truth about his lycanthropy. Not just that he was a werewolf. Yes. He could imagine telling her, her beautiful face waiting with anticipation as he tried his best to stutter and stammer through it. How her face would then change into worried incomprehension for a moment as she took in the more horrific, shocking and dreadful details about the grotesque changes in his body. What it made him feel like. The taste in his mouth. How he had to focus when he was around people in order for him to be able to distinguish between friend and food, until eventually there was no distinction to be made. The raw instinct unbounded by custom and respectability, making every feeling a hunger, making every hunger a visceral craving. The carpet was still the same as when his parents had died all those long years ago, brown, orange and mustard yellow concentric circles. The same as when he had come there to his grandmother's house. The same as when he had overheard his parents talking about Callias. He shouldn't have been listening, and at the time he had felt both a little happy that he wasn't alone and sad at his death, but the gravity of the situation had borne down on him and become weighty as the years had passed. He wasn't the sole target of a nightly terror, but the same attack he had endured had killed his brother. In another lifetime the carpet had worn threadbare in places where his father had paced monthly, worrying over his, Remus's, absence from the house and awaiting his return to his family home. Whence Remus had returned following the rise of Voldemort, coming home to hide after he had been informed hurriedly and bashfully that Sirius had murdered his friends. The friends he had saw so brutally adorning their bedroom. The living room had eventually become a prison where he had sat and gazed through that very window where the cumulonimbus had begun to accumulate and the darkness under the clouds radiated charcoal grey. He had stared at clouds like these for days on end, thinking about his lifelong past and wanting with every fibre of his being to believe it wasn't true. Knowing that if he dared show his face in civilized society he would be in Azkaban with the murderer Sirius Black. And then, after almost a decade, the lycanthropy laws had been relaxed upon the development and synthesis of a potion that tempered the effects of the lycanthropy. How Dumbledore had visited him when he was at his lowest, family money spent and no hope to earn any, how he had arrived with fresh hope and a vial of potion modified especially for him by Snape. How within weeks he had been able to live a freer life with a Dumbledore-directed purpose. He stared back into the hearth and, sighing heavily, he considered what the effects would be if he had told her the truth. Dumbledore had advised him to tell her at Christmas when he had spent the most fantastic night of his life with her. Or rather, he had advised to keep no secrets from those closest to him. But how could have even contemplated telling her, his Cecilia, when just thinking these thoughts about his own disgusting nature were so deeply repulsive to even himself? Having to burden her with it would be just too heartbreaking. Remus Lupin could feel his heart beating even quicker now as his thoughts raced around his medulla lobe. Yes, he could have told her and been honest, allowed her to come with him as she had boldly requested when he was a mere wolf, uncrazed. Shared with her the agony of the lunacy, on the night of an eclipse rather than playing it safe by confiding in Sirius. And yet what could be worse than Cecilia F? No. Remus halted his thoughts sharply. She wasn't Frobisher. Turned his head towards the fireplace, bit his tongue hard. She was not Cecilia Frobisher. He looked so sternly at the blackened bricks, oxidized by the combustion of flue powder and fuel, within the hearth that it was a wonder he didn't metamorphose them. She was, of course, he sighed in defeat. They should be married by now and she should be Cecilia Lupin. But knowing that she would soon lose her surname, to be replaced by his, however antiquated that notion seemed in the modern day. That had kept him going. Stopped his inadequacies manifesting themselves. Keeping them penned in and dammed up. And now that she was gone his mind was darkening as the rain cloud that was nearing, engulfing the valley that sat in its window frame, enshrouding it in shadow. Remus howled. 88,888,888. Look, we'll tell Harry together, he heard Ron say. No prizes for guessing who he was visiting at this hour of the night, and he scuttled to the underneath of the stairs as a pair of figures left the girls' dormitory and went into the boys'. So that'll be Hermione's genius doing then, thought Harry as he watched the door to the dorm close, and anger began to well in his stomach. Just what were they going to tell him? That they were going out? That they were married? That Ron had just been chosen for the All-England Quidditch Championships in Salford? Bling up his fists inside his pockets, Harry emerged from the shadows and headed downstairs towards the Gryffindor common room, invisibility cloak in absentia. He couldn't sleep. That was his excuse for being up at 3 in the morning on a school night. As usual there were things on his mind: Voldemort, the potion, Pallid Penrite, what the potion was going to contain this time, Snape, the absence of Mrs. Frobisher, where and what the Order's plans were. Opening the door to the back of the fat lady, Harry slid the portrait across, stepping out onto the corridor, and he began to pace agitatedly in a random direction. And he was angry. Angry with Ron in any case. Angry with them both. He was angry because he couldn't remember the last time he had been able to say anything to Ron without his best friend's response being, "I'll ask Hermione," or without him saying halfway through something, "Look mate, you understand, don't you?" He was angry that his friend had been taken away from him when he wanted to speak to him. And more especially he was angry for them being together. Harry stopped when he realized his furious walking had taken him to McGonagall's ground floor office, and he sighed in defeat. The times he and Ron had been there at this hour, clearly his mind was still in best friend mode even if his best friend wasn't. Sighing again, he opened the door and crept in, closing it behind him. Moments later and a green flue connection had been made between himself and his godfather. Sirius looked as he always did, confident and sympathetic to Harry's woes, but he wore an expression that Harry had not seen before, one of sadness or tiredness, like an inevitability that would soon come to pass and which he could do nothing about. "So, how are you, Harry?" asked Sirius, his face crackling in the fireplace. "How is it all going there at the moment? Good, I trust?" Despite himself, Harry nodded and shuffled closer to the hearth. And how is your work with your moral studies teacher? Well? Again Harry nodded, but this time said nothing. He couldn't answer, not express everything he wanted to say, but he also knew that Sirius Black was perceptive enough to see through his attempted indifference. Your work with Tabitha Penright from the Ministry is going well? Sirius repeated, and Harry nodded again. So, he confirmed. Wish it was Mrs. Frobisher, though. He watched Sirius nod, and this time it was his godfather's turn to inject an awkward silence into their conversation. Harry wanted to know what the matter was and had to glance at the ceramic tiles in the fireplace to prevent himself from asking Sirius what he wanted to. You realize he is attempting to allay the Ministry, and your moral studies teacher, through subterfuge? Harry nodded. Then just keep it up, continued Sirius, make a good job of it. He smiled, and then laughed a little. Trust what Snape is telling you, after he saved Mrs. Frobisher's life and so forth he deserves it. True, after he had a hand in her disappearance, I had my doubts. Sirius broke off, staring at his goddess unintently. From his godfather's reaction Harry realized that his shock must have been showing on his face. What? Harry's exclamation reverberated around McGonagall's classroom and he became rigid, waiting for the echo to die away. Sirius appeared to be waiting too, his expression now one of guilt. You're saying that Snape stole Mrs. Frobisher away from Lupin? He got her out of there just in time, just as the Ministry got in there. By all accounts, had he not done so, Percy Weasley would have received the glory for capturing the most wanted Mole of all time. His voice was low and steady. And cautious. So where? But Sirius cut him off. He was the secret keeper for Cecilia Frobisher. He cannot tell anyone, not even Remus, where she is. But, you should trust him. He's used information that Mrs. Frobisher gave to him before she disappeared to refine your potion. And I shouldn't have told you, so do not let anyone else know. Harry looked away again, trying to take it all in. Harry? He looked back to the fireplace and back to his godfather. Why do you trust him, Sirius? He saved her life. He saved yours. He's on our side. More's the pity. But he killed my parents. Voldemort did that. He let Wormtail know, retorted Harry defiantly. Sirius sighed. Look, life's not split into good and evil people. We all have a bit of each in us. Some things we are proud of and others of which we're ashamed. Harry, there's something I never told you, and perhaps I should. And Sirius proceeded to tell Harry how he had apologized to Snape about Henrietta and what he had done to him when they had been at school. He told Harry about his tormenting Snape, and that the wizard had little choice but to join the DFs. But you weren't to know, replied Harry loyally. How did you know that he was going to become the Death Eater? Trust me, said Sirius, I wasn't too nice a person at school. But I do know he is sorry for his involvement in your parents' death. I told you about Henrietta Edwards. We went out. But things were never truly right between us. I suppose that's why she chose the Mole world. Sirius paused. It's not just the lack of Mrs. Frobisher making this potion that's made you feel like this, he added. Harry shook his head and began to return the confidence that his godfather had shared with him and told him about Ron and Hermione, and how things had changed between him and his best friend. Sirius smiled sympathetically. Just like me and your dad. Things changed when he began to go out with your mum. But we still were best friends. I just had to accept that I had to share him. Harry nodded, but without much conviction. He didn't want to share Ron, as selfish as that seemed. All he wanted was their friendship to go back to the way it was. What Sirius was saying made sense, both about Ron and about Snape. Then a thought struck him, something that had been bothering him for some time. Something that he had wanted to discuss with Ron for almost a week, which he couldn't share with his godfather. Harry? He realized he must have been thinking hard when Sirius's voice alerted him to the here and now, and the intimacy of the scene faded. Have you ever experienced thoughts about things that haven't happened? Pardon? Memories. Thoughts, he clarified carefully. Have you ever been witness to something that you know certain things happened, and when you come across it again, the events are different? Like a memory slide, you mean? What? A memory slide, repeated Sirius. If you've come across one of those. He broke off and the green flames shuddered. Harry shifted his weight from one knee to another and waited for his godfather to continue. What's a memory slide? Harry asked when it was clear Sirius wasn't going to elaborate. Is it dangerous? Sirius shook his flaming head. It's a phenomenon not uncommon to memories. If a memory has been changed by the contributor, that is to say, the original thinker of the thought, then it is likely to be different to what you remember. It is used by mystery solvers. Harry nodded. That made sense. If you experienced it with your moral studies teacher, then Snape interrupted Harry as he recalled the scene again. So he wasn't imagining things. The memory in which Cecilia Frobisher was not only not asleep but was actually responding to the wizard's advances that he had inadvertently stumbled across had been changed from the events he and Ron had witnessed. By Snape. Snape. Is this what the problem is? Harry looked sharply at Sirius, who was shaking his head. Look, whatever you've seen in Snape's mind, I would forget about it. He wants to make sure the potion is safe for you, Harry, and I suggest that if you are working with him or your moral studies teacher, then keep your wits about you. Mysterias have been known to induce other things, some rather more serious than memory slides. So, Sirius continued, changing the subject, how are you? Apart from getting your head round Hermione and Ron? Harry shrugged. She seemed agitated about things. You spoke to Hermione? Harry stared at Sirius, confused. When? Why? I thought it was you, conceded Sirius, shaking his head slowly. She seemed concerned about something. She told me she had been learning science from Mrs. Frobisher. Hermione had spoken to Sirius. Harry looked at the tiles in the back of the hearth. Look, Harry, he said suddenly. I've got to go. The flu is probably being watched and I am needed elsewhere. His godson stared at him in silence. Trust in Severus Snape, Harry. He has your best interests at heart, of that I am convinced. Harry nodded. But something didn't quite ring true. Somehow he was not entirely won over by his reassurances. Sirius, what do I do? What if this potion's not ready for when I need it? He watched Sirius's face change slowly from concern to admonishment. Harry, you've got to start making your own choices. You're nearly of age. And what does that mean? Believe in yourself. Put your heart and soul behind what you are trying to achieve. Harry frowned and leaned backwards. At any other time he would feel proud his godfather was saying that to him. He was, but Harry made his way to the owlery. These days it was the only place he could think. The early hours of this June morning were cold and fresh, and his cheeks and hands were stinging as he climbed the spiral staircase and into the post room, now absent of many of its daytime occupants. One or two of those who were not on a nightly hunt glared at him accusingly and fluttered their wings. Ignoring them, Harry sat on the stone wall before the rows of letterholes and rested his arms on his jeans and his chin on his hands. What was it about Sirius? There was something not quite right about it all. After a chat with his godfather, Harry usually felt at ease with the future no matter what it held. Today he felt worse. Sirius had never told him to trust his own decisions before, and it had irked him not a little that he had apparently been free to offer advice to Hermione. And what cause did she have to speak to Sirius? Harry frowned. Sirius had explained away his fears adequately, but when it had come for reassurances, not only had Sirius proffered none, he had left Harry with no hope that he ever would. But he supposed, sighing deeply. He would have to come up with something himself then and not depend on the untrustworthy adults around him. Closing his eyes, Harry thought about Sirius again and his own reaction to his godfather's abdication of emotional support. Perhaps it was hard for him to speak to Harry like that. Perhaps he was giving him room to, well, make his own decisions. Giving his Sirius the benefit of the doubt, Harry's thoughts turned to the future. He looked across to the glassless window as a tawny and brown owl landed on the sill. He was going to have to face Voldemort, a greatly diminished but not defeated wizard. That was for sure, but as for when he could not tell. He would need to prepare, so there were only a few pieces of advice that were necessary to consider, both of which would equip Harry with skills and knowledge. He got to his feet and stretched. Somehow, thinking about things like that made him feel strangely at ease. He walked towards the window in the owlery and looked down at the darkened surroundings and at the sky, where a line of dawnlight underlined the indigo sky, and he thought back to a conversation that he had had with Sirius almost a month ago, when he had been at 12, Grimmauld Place. Voldemort was very much damaged by the spell he had used more than 16 years ago, and now, through the potion made by Snape with Cecilia Frobisher's help, he was almost defeated in February. If he regains his soul, he may be able to defeat you and rise to even greater power. Harry paced round the owlery and voiced a reply. I don't think so. I think he hid something, a part of himself somewhere safe, because he knew that he couldn't die without it. More owls, who had returned from late-night hunting, looked at Harry reproachfully. He ignored them and walked past the doorway to outside and resumed his contemplation. That had been Harry's suggestion. It was only now that he realized that Sirius had neither confirmed nor denied it. Perhaps Sirius was actually giving him assistance and guidance after all. So, thought Harry as he sat back on the small wall in the center of the owlery, reuniting Voldemort with his soul means that I can defeat him once and for all. But that was all very well. Where was his soul? And how exactly was he supposed to do that? He racked his mind for some ideas, but wished he had an apostrophe T. It wouldn't settle on something for long, rather the images flashed by quickly and confusingly. His friends disappearing off together. Mrs. Frobisher's absence. The presence of the people from the Ministry. Snape and that memory. Harry closed his eyes and fixed on what he had decided to pursue that would help him prepare for what was to come. Whatever that was. Whatever the future held, Harry thought gloomily. His own may be grim indeed. 88,888,888. The man looked up from the light box in the darkened room and rubbed his chin. It had been a long evening. He looked at the clock on the wall. The rest of his employees had already departed, having mind for information, gossip and fact since the early hours of the morning. It was just like any other evening in the editorial suite, and the editor was carrying out his usual duties. But there was something not quite as it should be, but for the life of him he couldn't think what. Disturbed, the editor of one of the major newspapers flicked the switch on the box where he had been scrutinizing the proofs of the pages, which would, in a few hours, be in the hands of millions of people across the country, and in a few more hours be in recycling bins, roads, cat litter trays, and perhaps even as protective packaging. Turning the dimmer switch off, he sat in the darkness and stared out of the window. Below, the lights of Wapping faded into the summer evening, and he watched a stray dog bounding along the street below, on and off the pavement. It wasn't the same as it had been. In his day, the bustle of journalists racing up Fleet Street to their various offices with stop-press news stories would be at its peak at this time of day. Some of them really did stop the presses, and work had to be hastily rewritten to be current and up-to-date for the sales stands the next day. Now, the work was faxed in if it was important, and little had to be done other than replace the stories with the new ones. The trespassers, hidden behind the office door, nudged one another. One of a pair of them gave his father the thumbs up, and this was returned with a grin. Now all we have to do is get out of here. whispered Arthur Weasley as he peered through the glass window in the intervening door. 3 more and we'll be done, lads. She's bound to read one of them, said George, nudging his brother. Fred nodded in agreement. Do you think he'll notice? George whispered to his father. Doubt it, replied Mr. Weasley. He didn't even notice that I reheated his coffee. Moles, said the twins in unison. Now, said Mr. Weasley as he watched the editor return to his proofs box, scanning the back page that announced the football results, all we need to do is get out of here. He watched his sons grin at one another. Lads, he added. The twins looked at him. Don't tell your mother. 88,888,888. Good evening. The door to the terraced house in which Mr. and Mrs. Smith lived clicked on the latch, and as Nick Smith entered their home he heard the voice of his wonderful wife through 3 doors. Good evening, Uncle Nick. He smiled and opened the front room door. On the velour-covered settee sat Tunks and Freya, both reading books. His foster daughter launched herself off the sofa and into Nick's arms, leaving the biochemist slightly bemused. He looked over the 9-year-old's shoulder at Tunks, who had put down her book and was smiling at him. Good day? He asked of his wife as he kissed Freya on the cheek. She nodded. We played, drew and read, didn't we, Freya? The girl nodded as Tunks smiled at Nick and got to her feet. Show Uncle Nick what we've done. She didn't need to ask twice, and the girl picked up a silver and black picture that she held aloft triumphantly. Auntie Tracy helped me with the glitter, said Freya happily. And then we talked about the world, and the continents, and I learned the capital cities of all of the ones in Europe. And Auntie Tracy says that I'll be going to school soon. Nick shot Tunks a look, and she returned it with one of her own, slightly forlorn and guilty. Freya darling, said Tunks as the girl sat down on the settee again. Uncle Nick and I have some things to talk about. I cooked some dinner for us. Do you think you'd be good enough to go upstairs and wash your hands, and then come and lay the table? Freya looked quickly between Tunks and Nick, then nodded obediently. Once the door closed, Tunks sat back down and Nick sat next to her. Kissing her on the cheek, he turned the book's cover over and looked at the title. The Witch's Guide to Childcare, asked Nick chidingly. You don't need this, Tunks. You're doing a great job as it is. So says you, a bachelor a month ago, she replied, tapping him on the arm reproachfully. I mean, I don't know how to look after a child. Mum was little help. She knows how to bring up wizard children, and I can hardly use magic here, especially as she's a mole. She stopped as Nick laid a hand on hers. You're a natural with children. Nick kissed her on the cheek again. I mean, after what she's been through. And she's accepted her move here. She remembers me. She asked for her mum today, said Tunks, a solemn look on her face as the color drained out of her short, spiky hair. I think she meant Cecilia's sister. I asked her what she remembered about living in Scotland, and she said that she remembered a fire, and that she was here while they found somewhere new to live. I went along with that. Good, said Nick, turning on the settee to face her. I'm not sure about her starting school, though. It'll nearly be the end of the school year, and they'll have more time to ask questions. Far better to wait. Why? To see what happens. You mean? Nick shook his head. If she is to be permanently with us, I can arrange for proper documentation. Questions will be asked, but I'm sure you can sort that out. Tunks nodded firmly. Did you look at the traces today? She asked. The ones for father? I know it's an ask, but I also know how much Snape needs these for the potion. Tunks exhaled deeply as she saw Nick nod, and from his briefcase he pulled them back out. Holding them out in front of him, he pointed to some of the lines and looked between the document and Tunks, trying to find the right words to explain what it all meant. Tunks shook her head. You don't need to tell me the specifics, but from the information, does it show anything unusual?